Today I'd like to talk about the inadequacy of atheism, looking at atheism as a belief system, and looking at some of the serious weaknesses, as Nick alluded to earlier. But before we get going, I guess I'd talk to you about the dyslexic atheist. You're familiar with dyslexia. That's where you move letters around, right? Well, the dyslexic atheist, of course, asserts that there is no dog rather than no God, because he has the problem of the... I actually like the dyslexic agnostic who suffers from insomnia better. He stays up late at night wondering whether there is or isn't a dog, and that is the dyslexic agnostic. I think the place to begin in discussing atheism and talking about some of the inadequacies of atheism is to really give a definition for atheism. Atheism, etymologically, that is, in terms of the origin of the word, comes to us from the Greek language. The Greek word for God is theos. To place an A before that would be atheos, or no God. And so, strictly speaking, atheism is no Godism. No Godism. Standard definition given by the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, given by Webster's Dictionary, is that atheism is the denial of the existence of God or a rejection of belief in God. Now, just as there are varieties of Christians, there are also varieties of atheists. Atheists do not argue the same way all of the time. They argue based upon what it is that grounds their unbelief. Now, you've heard some lectures today about the kinds of things that provide a foundation for believing in Christianity. You've heard some things today about the foundation upon which our faith rests. Well, atheists also attempt to argue their atheism based upon some attempt to ground their thinking in reality. Now, I would argue, as Nick has, that there really isn't a solid foundation at all for atheism, but I want you to be aware that there are a variety of atheisms or atheistic viewpoints. The first one I want to mention is what I call dogmatic atheism. Dogmatic atheism. This is also called offensive atheism. It's the person who simply says, I know God doesn't exist. I would say that the best reflection of this kind of village atheism is reflected in the thinking of somebody like Madalyn Murray O'Hair. This is the kind of self-assertive atheism that we find in the typical atheistic societies. Of course, there's a problem with asserting that God doesn't exist. It's just like when I go to some of my relatives' house. I'm Irish, and so sometimes when some of my relatives drink a little bit too much, they begin to ask me whether there are leprechauns. And it seems that the more whiskey they drink, the more they want to ask about leprechauns. Seems to be a correlation there to some degree. Well, I used to tell them, absolutely not. There are no leprechauns. And then they would ask me, have you looked everywhere? Well, there is a similar difficulty in asserting the non-existence of God. In philosophy and in logic, we call that the attempt to prove a universal negative. There are limitations to disproof. A positive affirmation, like Sacramento is the capital of California, or Madrid is the capital of Spain. These are positive existential statements that can be investigated and checked out. But if I told you that there are no black geese, that would be a much more difficult statement to check out, to prove wrong. And so when the village atheists ask me or assert the fact that there is no God, I simply ask them, how do you know that? How can you with confidence assert that there is no God? So there's a real difficulty there. They run into a dead end, so to speak. And because atheism is a very difficult worldview to defend, And because there are limitations to disproof and the problem of the universal negative, some atheists have become a little more sophisticated in attempting to defend atheism. This leads us to the second variety. I call them defensive atheists, or a atheist that is a little bit more subtle. They would assert that atheism is not rejection of God, but the absence of belief in God. God's existence is not disproven, but unproven. Now, I want you to see that subtlety. The defensive atheists, they don't go around saying, I know God does not exist. They simply say, I have an absence of belief in God. I'm not asserting that God has been disproven. I'm simply asserting that God's existence remains unproven. An example in this particular area of epistemological thinking, or thinking that relates to knowledge. One particular atheist, Antony Flew, he has said, in the lack of evidence of God, then everyone should presume atheism. He is asserting a principle that is similar to the courtroom procedure, that one is to be presumed innocent before one is found guilty in a court of law. Antony Flew says one should simply presume atheism until somebody comes along with a knockdown argument for God. Now, I want you to think about this definition a little bit. According to the defensive atheists, atheism is in fact not rejection of belief in God. They're not asserting that God does not exist. They're simply saying, I have an absence of belief in God, and therefore I am simply asserting that God's existence is unproven. Here we would have certain examples. I think George Smith, in his book, The Case Against God, would be a very good example of a defensive atheist. And also, Dr. Gordon Stein would be a good example of defensive atheists. Now, let me offer a criticism of this definition of atheism. First of all, to say that atheism is not disbelief in God or the rejection of God, but merely the absence of belief in God, is to create a stipulative definition. In logic, a stipulative definition is when you invent a definition for a word for the first time. That is, this is a non-standard definition for atheism. To say that you don't reject belief in God, or you don't believe in God, but merely have an absence of belief, this is not the standard definition for atheism. In fact, the editor of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Paul Edwards, is himself an ardent atheist, and he defines atheism as rejection of God, disbelief in God. Secondly, now let's talk about this absence of belief in God. God's not disproven, God's unproven. That's their assertion. Well, when I reflect upon that for a moment, if I say God's existence is unproven, as the defensive atheists assert, it would seem to me that an unproven proposition or an unproven statement, i.e., God exists, if it is unproven, then there are three possible options. It may remain unproven, it may become disproven, or it may become proven. That is, to take the defensive atheist position, it doesn't seem to be any different from agnosticism. To say I have an absence of belief in God, God remains unproven but not disproven, that to me really is the essence of agnosticism. And of course, agnosticism, coming to us again from the Greek, gnosis is one of the Greek words for knowledge. You place an A in front of it, you negate it. So agnosis, or agnosticism, is the belief that one does not or cannot know ultimate reality, especially God. Agnosticism is an inability to determine whether God exists because of an alleged insufficiency of knowledge. Now, the problem with that is, that seems to be what the defensive atheists are saying. They're saying God's existence isn't proven. Well, if it's not proven, then it may become proven, or it may become disproven. And so I think not only does the dogmatic atheist position crumble epistemologically, again, when you deal with knowledge and the issue of knowledge or question of knowledge, but defensive atheism really seems like an effort to try to dodge the problems with atheism. And so they go into some type of agnosticism. Now, the third type of atheism is what I'm going to call philosophical atheism. And this is certainly a more reflective approach to atheism. Philosophical atheism simply says that God's existence should be rejected because belief in God reduces to absurdity. They simply say there are no good reasons to believe in God, or belief in God is fundamentally flawed. Now, they would take several different arguments, thus their unbelief is grounded in one of three ways. A philosophical atheist may say, God is a meaningless concept. That is, when we talk about the term God, God has no meaning. It's an arf. It has no definition or meaning to it. Of course, the problem with that is that is based upon an early 20th century approach to philosophy called analytic philosophy, and their verification principle was something only has meaning if it can be defined or if it can be verified through the five senses. So statements like black cats are black has meaning. Triangles have three sides has meaning. Bachelors or unmarried men has meaning because what is in the predicate is already in the subject. And they would say things that can be seen or heard, smelled, tasted, or touched have meaning. But the idea of God has no definitional meaning and God has no empirical meaning. Well, the problem with that is the idea of the verification principle itself. That is, the idea that something only has meaning if you can define it in terms of tautology, or something only has meaning if you can define it empirically. The verification principle itself can't be seen. That is to say, I only believe in something if you can define it or see it, cannot itself be seen. So the idea that God is a meaningless concept is fraught with problems. By the way, every time you address an atheist and say the term God, it seems to have some meaning for him. He tells us that God doesn't exist. If God had no meaning, then he couldn't tell us anything at all. So he seems to contradict himself. Secondly, some philosophical atheists will say that the concept of God is incoherent. Something is incoherent if it is internally inconsistent, if it is logically contradictory. And they will say that if you think about an omnipotent, an all-powerful God, and an omniscient God, that these characteristics, these attributes are somehow contradictory. Of course, the problem is that classical Christian philosophers, such as Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, and a whole list of modern Christian philosophers of religion have pointed out that these attributes do not in fact contradict themselves. Again, the reference earlier about the immovable object and the irresistible force. That question by its very nature is contradictory. Now, thirdly, some philosophical atheists ground their atheism in the idea that belief in God is incompatible with either our knowledge of science or our knowledge of evil. And because I'm going to deal with science in a few minutes, I want to say something about the issue of evil. Reformed Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga has pointed out that there's no incompatibility between the existence of God in the world on one hand and belief in an omnibenevolent, omnipotent God. That is, some would say if God was all-powerful, he could get rid of evil. If God was omnibenevolent, all-loving and kind, he would get rid of evil. But since evil still exists, either God is not good or God is not all-powerful. In fact, that's what the Scottish skeptical philosopher of the 18th century, David Hume, said. He said, look, you've either got to have a God who's good but not all-powerful, or an all-powerful God who's not good, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. Well, philosophers like Alvin Plantinga have pointed out that there is no incompatibility with that. God has created a world that contains evil. And God, because he is omniscient, has a very good reason to allow evil. Therefore, evil exists in the world. There's no logical tension between the existence of evil, on one hand, and the nature of the Christian God. Secondly, oftentimes atheists attempt to use evil as the dagger in the heart of Christian belief. But in reality, evil is a proof of God. And you say to yourself, how is that possible? Well, if you assert that something is evil, if you say torturing children for the fun of it is evil, if you say rape is evil, if you say mass murder is evil, you are presupposing a transcendental ground of goodness by which to judge something good or evil. That is, in an atheistic world, in order to call something evil, you have to have some benchmark. You have to have some appeal to the transcendental. And so all of these years, Christians have been troubled by the fact that evil was somehow a great force against the faith. Christian philosophers have been capable of pointing out that to call something evil, you have to have an understanding of goodness. And if you think, as I do, torturing children for the fun of it is evil, you have to appeal to a ground of goodness by which to judge them. Who would some of the philosophical atheists be? Examples would be Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, Karl Marx, the father of the communist movement, the psychoanalytic leader in the 20th century, Sigmund Freud, the greatest educator of the 19th and 20th century in America, the man who single-handedly transformed public education in America, a man named John Dewey, the French existentialist, philosopher, and playwright, Jean-Paul Sartre, the Oxford philosopher in the 20th century, J.L. Mackie. I mentioned Antony Flew, who is still alive today, and of course Kai Nielsen and Paul Edwards, the editor of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. These men are all brilliant individuals, but as we'll see in a few minutes, atheism is not necessarily something that has arrived from a lack of intelligence. These men are intelligent men. But intelligent men can sometimes come to deeply flawed viewpoints. Now, in looking at atheism, I want to connect atheism to its natural worldview. And when I use the term worldview, I mean a grid, a conceptual grid for understanding reality. A worldview is how you make sense of the world. A worldview is how you interpret reality. I like to think of a worldview as the Christian philosopher Ronald Nash says, and that is, a worldview is like a pair of glasses. For those of you who wear glasses all the time, as opposed to somebody like me who wears only sunglasses, that time is coming, I'm afraid, where I will have to wear glasses almost all the time. But you know, as a person who wears glasses, that you see everything through the lenses of those glasses. Everything comes into you through the lenses of the glasses. The glasses interpret the world for you. Well, all of us have a worldview. All of us interpret reality, and I'm going to give you an illustration of how a worldview can either bring you closer to reality or it can push you further away. I was watching television late at night because I suffer from insomnia, and television, about the only thing it's good for is helping you to fall asleep. And so I was watching, and they had a commercial on blue blocker sunglasses. And it was very appealing to me, and my wife was asleep, so I could allow my impulsive shopper attitude to come out. And there was even a guy on there who was giving a jingle and a rap song about the blue blockers, and I thought, boy, these must be great. They must be the next thing to slice bread. So I got my credit card out, and I ordered a pair of blue blocker sunglasses. Well, when I got them, I took them out of the case and I put them on. I was standing in my backyard. It was a very sunny day. And when I put the glasses on, I had the impression like there was no lenses in the glasses. That is, it seemed like everything was clearer. It seemed like my focus of reality was clearer. Reality was brought closer to me. I could also look almost up into the sun, and usually, even when your eyes come near the sun, there is all of the haze, and it's difficult to do. But I was able to look very close to the sun, and it took a lot of the haze away. So in one sense, that pair of glasses brought me closer to reality, or at least that was my perception. Now later, however, I realized that there are certain problems with blue blocker sunglasses. First of all, they distort color. I was in a little snack shop at Cerritos College where I teach, and they have this little room called the elbow room where you can go in and buy a snack in between class. And so being a philosopher, I was looking for some chewing gum, and I wanted juicy fruit. The natural selection of all true philosophers is juicy fruit. You may not know that, but that's true. And if anybody comes up here and tells you otherwise, you know they're not a true philosopher, right? Well, they had this big jar of Wrigley's chewing gum, and it was very large, and so I was looking into the jar, and if I wasn't reading, I was looking for the color yellow. And it seemed like all the packs of gum were white, or they were green. So I said to the lady who was working there, I said, you know, you run this place, you have all of these packs of Wrigley's chewing gum, and you have no juicy fruit? And she looked at me, she looked at the jar, she looked at me, and she said, you're a philosophy teacher, right? No, she didn't say that. She said, sir, there is juicy fruit throughout the bottle. So I took my glasses off. Sure enough, there were plenty of juicy fruit in there. My glasses distort color. It makes yellow look white. It makes orange look pink. This, of course, illustrates that a poor worldview can also push you further away from reality. A good worldview will tighten your focus. An inadequate worldview will take you further away. Well, what is the worldview upon which atheism rests? It is the worldview known as naturalism. Naturalism. Naturalism is the belief system that regards the natural, material, and physical universe as the only reality. Nature is the whole show, so to speak. Naturalism is characterized by monism. Monism is the belief that all reality is one. Materialism, the belief that matter is the sole reality, that everything can be reduced to or explainable in terms of matter. Naturalism is also anti-supernatural. They believe that everything happens naturally, physically, materially, chemically. There is nothing above the natural world. And they believe in scientism, which is not science. Scientism is the belief that science is the only reliable knowledge. And lastly, they're humanistic. They believe that man is the measure of all things. Now, in looking at naturalism, naturalism would say this. Naturalism would say that everything, things, people, events, can be reduced to matter in motion. Everything is just the chemical, electrical, physical reactions that are taking place in the world. Everything is reducible to or explainable in terms of physics, chemistry, and biology. They would say only physical matter exists. The physical universe is the only thing that exists, and therefore everything is explainable in light of physics, chemistry, and biology. There's no God, because God is an infinite, eternal, personal spirit. Spirits do not exist. Angels do not exist. Human beings do not have immaterial souls. And so naturalism is the worldview that underlies this. Now, in taking this a step further, there are plenty of people who are atheistic We mentioned some of them. Somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre would argue this way. Someone like Karl Marx would argue this way. Someone like Sigmund Freud would argue this way. And of course, it's difficult to underestimate the influence of somebody like a Freud or somebody like a Marx. Now, they would say that science makes belief in God unnecessary. Science makes belief in God unnecessary, and this is the assertion that the modern scientific person really doesn't have to believe in God any longer. God was a crutch that was used by people early in life as an explanation of the mysteries in nature. And so I want to talk a little bit about these two rival theories about God. The first one, of course, is the atheistic position. It's best reflected in what I call the magic theory. The magic theory. And it's seen in James Frazier's book, The Golden Bough. James Frazier said, this is where the concept of God came from. The cavemen wandered out of their caves and began hunting and gathering and foraging, and they experienced certain mysteries in nature, thunder and lightning, earthquakes, natural phenomena, and they said to themselves, it must have been the crocodile god. And thus they had a magical way of looking at the world. They thought there were spirits and entities in the ocean and spirits in the wind. And so nature is filled with these spirits or gods. And of course they would say, that's the belief in magic. It's superstition. And so God, according to this atheistic position, was invented as an explanation for the mysteries in the universe. Now, they take us a little further down their timeline. They say the cavemen held to kind of a magical theory. And of course, now we know in modern science that thunder is not God moving the furniture around. It is the vacuum that is created and the closing of the vacuum. They say, and if you trace the timeline a little bit further, you find in the medieval period the place where the Christian church was the dominant force in Western civilization. And now religion is just a little bit more of a sophisticated magical theory. Religion tries to give sophistication to superstition, is what the atheists would say. And then, of course, with the coming of the 18th century and the Enlightenment period and the development of modern science, now people throw off religion just as they threw off the magic of the cavemen. And nobody who is scientifically informed would believe in God. Science is now our way of understanding the mysteries in nature. We don't have to assume God. Now, that's certainly one model, isn't it? And if you go to a college or university, a secular variety, you will certainly hear that explanation of God. If you take a psych class, you will hear people say that Sigmund Freud thought that religious people were suffering from an infantile neurosis. Let me give you an interpretation of that. He means that religious people are people who have simply refused to grow up. And we kind of hold on to God the way Linus would hold on to his blanket. And Freud said human beings are incessantly religious, and they're basically afraid, and if they became more scientifically minded, they would give up the superstition that is religion. Well, you hear this theory frequently in psych classes. I had a student who was in my philosophy class and was simultaneously taking a psychology class. And so the psych professor came over and said, I don't know if you should take Professor Sample's philosophy class. And the student, being somewhat gullible, said, well, why? He said, well, don't you know, if you study too much philosophy, you'll go insane. So the student came to me and said, is it true that if you study too much philosophy, you might go insane? And I said, well, you might, but if you study psychology, psychologists and psychiatrists have the highest rate of suicide. So I said, if you stay with me, you might go insane, but if you stay with him, you might die. He's still very troubled by this event. No. Now, setting aside the atheistic model, the magic theory, where we go from magic religion into the modern scientific world, let me then give the biblical viewpoint of the nature of God and the origin of God. The Bible says that God, an infinite, eternal, tripersonal spirit, exists as an objective reality apart from our mind and apart from our will. And that this God, who is the transcendent creator and immanent sustainer of the world, has revealed himself through the Old and New Testament scriptures. And therefore, the Bible would assert that there is an objective and historical basis for believing in God. Who is God? God is a personal spiritual being who revealed himself to people like Noah, to people like Abraham, to people like Moses, and revealed himself to them and told him that he was the eternal God. And therefore, God's not something that we have contracted because our Aunt Louise locked us in a closet. God is not the product, as Karl Marx said, of the rich ruling class wanting to oppress the poor. It doesn't have anything to do with economics. God is an objective being that existed prior to the creation of the universe. By the way, there are some people, principally feminists, who would say that God was created by men in order to oppress women. That's an interesting theory that's floating across the colleges and universities. Well, the Bible says that God exists independent of the created order, and that our mind and our will does not affect him. In fact, his mind and his will affects us. Well, what I'd like to do now is I would like to talk about why God's existence is necessary in the scientific world. Why it is necessary to believe in God, and why without God there is a tremendous unfolding of all of our beliefs. Now, the first point I make, and again, this is reasons why God remains necessary in the scientific world. The first point I want to make is, without the biblical God, there's no basis for science. You see, I would assert the opposite of the atheist. The atheist would say, well, science has made God unnecessary. I would assert, without the biblical God, there's no foundation for science whatsoever. Assume the position of atheism for a moment, that God does not exist, that the universe has come into existence, however it has, over billions and billions of years by blind, non-purposeful, mechanistic natural processes. The universe is simply the product of chemistry, physics, biology. Well, here's my question. How could you ever have science in that situation? How would you ever have the order, the uniformity of nature? How would you ever have something other than chaos and strife? That is, how can you ever assert in an atheistic world that is here by chance, by naturalistic processes, by blind mechanistic processes, how could you ever assert the uniformity of nature? Now, the uniformity of nature is a scientific principle that basically says that nature is uniform.